Let's take a breath, shall we, and settle in for the night. The room is quiet, or maybe it isn't, but let's pretend it is. Let's pretend the world outside has grown soft and slow, with all its edges rounded off, and the only sound is the steady hum of your own breathing. You're comfortable, I trust, warm enough or cool enough, in that way that feels like a blanket you don't need, but like having anyway. We're going to go somewhere tonight, you and I, somewhere very old and very hot in its way. And yet here we are, safe in the cool dark, about to wander into a story that happened long ago. Under a sun so fierce, it seems impossible that anyone could have lived beneath it. But live they did. And not only live, but work and sweat and chip away at the earth for something that glittered in their hands. We're going to talk about gold and the people who mined it deep in the sun-scorched deserts of Nubia, a land that is now part of Egypt and Sudan, along the banks of the Nile, and far beyond it, into the red and yellow wilderness of stone and sand. And if you've never thought about Nubia, well, that's fine, because tonight we have all the time in the world to think about it together. That's the luxury of a late-night story. We're not in a hurry. The clock is irrelevant. The stars are out, or they're not, but in our minds they are. And so we drift gently, like a slow boat on a wide river, back through the centuries, back to a time when the pyramids were new, or not yet built, and the great pharaohs of Egypt were sending expeditions into the burning emptiness of the Nubian desert, not for conquest, not for glory, but for the shiny, heavy metal that would adorn their temples, their tombs, their bodies, and their dreams. Let's find our way there first. Close your eyes, if you like, and imagine a map. The desert is vast, so vast that the mind bounces off it like light off a mirror. There's nothing to hold on to, just endless expanses of sand and rock, dry riverbeds called wadis, and mountains that rise like broken bones against an impossibly blue sky. And in the middle of all this emptiness, there are places where the earth has been clawed at by human hands in patterns that look almost like scars. These are the ancient mines. Some of them are thousands of years old. Their shafts plunge into the ground at strange angles, following veins of quartz that glimmer with tiny flecks of gold, so small that you have to squint to see them, but so valuable that people were sent to die for them, or to live for them, and sometimes, I suppose, to find meaning in them. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start not with the mines, but with the stone, or the sand, or the heat, because the heat was the real enemy, the real constant companion, the thing that every Nubian gold miner had to understand and endure before he could ever hope to extract a single speck of the precious metal. You see, the desert doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care about the pharaoh's orders or the size of your ambition. It only cares about the sun and the way the sun beats down on the bare rock until the air shimmers with it. And the rocks are so hot they burn your hand if you touch them, and your breath comes shallow and painful, and your skin turns the color of old leather, and your eyes ache from the glare. Now, you might think, in your cozy modern room, with your soft blanket and your quiet breaths, that such heat would be unbearable. And you'd be right. It was unbearable. And yet, humans endured it. They endured it because they had to, because the gold was there, and because the gold meant something, not just to the pharaohs up in Thebes or Memphis, but to the whole machinery of ancient Egyptian civilization. Gold was the flesh of the gods. It was the material that glowed with its own inner light, the color of the sun itself, and so it was sacred. It had to be mined because the gods demanded it, and because the dead needed it for their journey into the afterlife. And so, every summer, or in certain seasons, the mining expeditions would set out. Let's think about who these miners were, shall we? Because that's where the story grows softer and stranger and more human. They weren't volunteers, not most of them, not at first. They were prisoners of war, or criminals sentenced to hard labor, or sometimes whole communities of Nubian people who were pressed into service. You may have heard about the gold mines of ancient Egypt, and you may have imagined something like a dark, cold tunnel underground, almost peaceful, a respite from the sun. And that's true in part. The shafts did provide shade. They were cool, comparatively, but they were also dark and cramped and choking with dust, and the work was brutally repetitive. And above the shafts, waiting at the surface, was the heat and the guards and the overseers. But let's not focus on the cruelty, not right away. Let's focus on the endurance, because that's our theme tonight. How did they do it? How did these men and women, and sometimes children, survive days, weeks, months, in a place where the sun was a tyrant and water was a memory? There's an account from much later, from the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who wrote about the Egyptian gold mines in the 1st century BC. He described the miners as captives and prisoners, chained in the tunnels, toiling without rest. And he described the harshness of it all, the death that came from overwork and starvation and the heat. But Diodorus was writing from a distance, and his account is grim. We can learn more, perhaps, from the physical traces left behind, and from the careful work of modern archaeologists who have walked the same deserts, crouched in the same shafts, and tried to understand what life was really like in this strange, sun-baked underworld. One of the interesting things is that the miners didn't just go into the desert blindly. They knew the land. They had been living in it for generations. The Nubians, in particular, were the original people of the region, and they had a deep knowledge of the resources, of the gold-bearing regions, of the locations of water sources, of the paths that led through the mountains. So when the Egyptians came looking for gold, they often relied on this local knowledge. They hired or forced Nubian guides and miners to show them where to dig. And in the process, these Nubian miners developed techniques that were, in their own way, remarkably sophisticated. Let me tell you about the water first, because water was everything. Without water, no one could survive the trek, let alone the mining itself. And so the ancient mining routes were studded with wells and cisterns, some of them dug very deep into the ground. These wells marked out the paths like beads on a string. They were the lifeline, the one thing that made the whole enterprise possible. And they were jealously guarded because if you lost a well, you lost the ability to return home. Now imagine a group of miners making their way along one of these routes. They would have traveled in the cool hours, perhaps, in the early morning or evening, because even ancient people, tough as they were, knew not to march at noon. They would have carried water in animal skins, slung over their backs. They would have had donkeys, perhaps, loaded with provisions, with bread and dates and onions, and the tools of their trade, stone hammers, copper chisels, baskets for carrying broken rock. And they walked, or they were marched for days, through valleys where the only sound was the crunch of their own footsteps, and the sigh of the wind, and the occasional cry of a hawk. But we're not going to march with them, not right now. We're going to float above them, invisible like a soft breeze, and watch them as they set up their camp at the foot of a mountain. The mountain is not tall, but it's steep, and its slopes are dark and red, and it glows in the late afternoon sun. The miners fan out along the base of it, and they begin to look for the signs that only the experienced eye can read. A slight discoloration in the rock, a streak of white quartz, a particular texture that hints at hidden treasure. And once they've found the right spot, they begin to dig. But they don't dig the way we might imagine, with pickaxes and shovels. They dig with the most primitive of tools, large stones, harder than the surrounding rock, which they use to pound against the surface. It's a slow process, an incredibly slow process, and it requires a kind of patience that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. But this is how it was done. Pound and pound and pound, and watch as the rock breaks away, inch by inch, foot by foot. Now, here's a little secret about the ancient miners, a technique that they developed that was rather clever. Sometimes the rock was too hard for pounding. It resisted, stubborn and unyielding. And so the miners would build a fire against the rock face, a great roaring fire of wood and dry brush, and they would heat the rock until it was scorching hot. And then they would pour cold water over it. And the sudden shock of cold would cause the rock to crack and crumble, splitting along its lines of weakness. This was called fire setting, and it was a common technique in ancient mining all over the world. It was also dangerous, of course. The poisonous fumes, the smoke, the heat, the flying shards of rock. But it worked. It worked when nothing else would. So you can imagine the scene, the fires burning in the desert night, the glow of the coals, the hiss of water on hot stone, the steam rising up into the darkness. And the miners, hardened, silent, moving like shadows. They were not picturesque. They were covered in dust and soot, their hands rough, their eyes weary. But there was a rhythm to their work, a kind of choreography, and it's that rhythm that we're going to focus on tonight, because it's the rhythm of endurance itself. It's the rhythm of the human body, trying to keep going, one breath at a time, one blow at a time, one day at a time. Let's talk about the shafts. Once the miners had broken through the outer rock, they would follow the vein of quartz downward, carving a narrow shaft into the mountain. The shafts are incredibly narrow, just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. They go down at an angle, following the twists and turns of the gold-bearing stone. And inside these shafts, the miners worked in the dark. They used small oil lamps, perhaps, burning animal fat, to provide a dim, flickering light. The air was stale and thick. The heat of the sun was blocked, yes, but there was a heat of its own underground, a warmth that seeped from the earth and combined with the warmth of their bodies to make the air feel heavy and damp. And here, in this cramped, dark space, they pounded and chipped and dug. They removed the quartz in chunks, passing it hand to hand from the depths of the shaft to the surface, where other workers would break it up, using large stone mortars and pestles, grinding the rock into fine powder to release the gold flakes. And then, the crucial step, washing. The powdered rock would be taken to a water source, a stream perhaps, or a basin of collected water, and slowly, patiently, washed in shallow pans or on tilted stone tables. The lighter rock would wash away, carried by the current, leaving behind the heavy gold, a tiny residue of glittering dust and flakes at the bottom of the pan. Now, there is a particular gentleness to this washing process, if you think about it. After all the violence of the pounding, the brute force of the hammers, the fire, the shattering of rocks, the washing was almost delicate. It was a skill. It required a steady hand and a keen eye, because the gold was fine, so fine, and the rock was relentless. And in this final stage, the miner would be hunched over the water, concentrating, breathing slowly, letting the water do its work. And the gold would appear, just a few tiny glints, and he would carefully gather them into a small pouch, perhaps a cloth bag tied to his waist. And after a day's work, the total take might be only a few small crumbs, but those crumbs were everything. So, how did they endure the heat in the midst of all this? We can imagine them finding small pockets of shade, wedging themselves into crevices in the rock to escape the afternoon sun. We can imagine them wrapping their heads in cloth to keep the sweat from dripping into their eyes, and possibly to protect their necks from the worst of the burn. We can imagine them drinking from their water skins, taking small sips, not gulping, because water had to be conserved, and there was never enough, and the next well was days away. But there were other strategies, more subtle ones. The miners often worked in shifts, with different teams tackling different parts of the process. Some would work in the shafts, where it was cooler during the heat of the day. Others would work on the surface, breaking the quartz in the early morning before the sun grew too fierce. And the heavy work, the fire setting, would be reserved for the evening, when the desert began to cool and the sky filled with the first stars. It was a kind of rotation, a drowsy, rotating pattern that acknowledged the sun's power and worked around it rather than against it. And there's something else too, something that we might call ritual. The ancient miners did not approach their work with a purely mechanical mindset. They lived in a world that was full of meaning, full of gods and spirits, full of unseen forces. For them, the gold was not just metal. It was a gift or a test from the earthly world. And so they would have performed little ceremonies, perhaps, before starting a new shaft, or when they struck a rich vein. They might have made offerings, a bit of bread, a drop of water, to the gods of the underworld, to the local spirits of the mountains. These small acts of respect would have made the work bearable in a way that we might struggle to grasp. They gave the miners a sense that they were not alone, that there was a purpose to their labor beyond their own suffering. One such god, or rather goddess, was Hathor, who was associated with the desert and with the turquoise and copper mines of Sinai, and with gold, too, in some aspects. The ancient miners would call out to her or to other protective deities as they descended into the dark. And these prayers, these whispered words, would have echoed in the tunnels, a soft, rhythmic murmur that kept time with the pounding of the hammers. It's a strange image, isn't it? The dark shaft, the smell of earth and sweat, the flicker of the lamps, and the low, mumbling sound of a person speaking to a presence that no one else could see. Let's drift now away from the mine itself and into the camp, because the miners' endurance was not just about the hours spent underground. It was also about the time spent at rest, such as it was. The camp would be a collection of rough shelters, made from whatever was at hand. Tents of animal hide, perhaps, or huts of stone and brush. The food was simple and monotonous. We know that the mining expeditions were supplied with grain, which was used to make bread, and with beer, a weak, nutritious brew that was consumed at every meal. There would have been onions and garlic and lentils, and sometimes, for celebrations, a bit of meat. The miners would eat, and then they would sleep, sprawled on the ground, wrapped in their cloaks, under the vast, immense sky. And here, the heat of the day would finally recede, draining away from the rocks and the sand, and the air would become sharp and dry and astonishingly cold. Desert nights are like that, extreme in their own way, and the miners, who had spent the day in the heat, would now shiver, perhaps, huddling together for warmth. They would look up at the stars, and the stars would be so bright, so close, that they seemed to be a canopy of lights just above their heads. And they would be aware, in that dark silence, of the vastness of the world they were in, the emptiness, the indifference, but also, perhaps, of a strange and simple beauty. We should take a moment to think about the sounds of the camp, because for a sleepy story, sounds are important. The low murmur of conversation, the crackle of a small fire, the sound of someone chewing slowly on a piece of hard bread, the murmur of a prayer again before sleep, the distant howl of a jackal calling from the hills. And then, gradually, the sounds would fade one by one as people fell asleep, their bodies heavy with exhaustion. And the only sound that remained would be the breathing of many people, in and out, a soft, collective rhythm, like the tide. If we want to understand how the miners endured, we have to understand this rhythm of exhaustion and rest. Their bodies were pushed to limits that we, in our soft modern lives, can barely imagine. But they also had the capacity to sleep deeply, to surrender completely to unconsciousness, because they had no other choice. And in that surrender, they found the strength to wake up and do it all over again. It wasn't a choice, not really. It was survival. But there's a kind of dignity in that, a purity of purpose that we can admire from the safe distance of our beds. Now, let's go back in time, even further, just for a little while. The Nubian gold mines are ancient, but they didn't start with the Egyptians. The people of Nubia themselves, the Sea Group culture, or the even earlier peoples of the Neolithic period, had been mining gold and other minerals for centuries before the first dynastic Egyptian pharaoh took the throne. They knew the desert intimately. They knew where to find water, where to find stone, where to find the gold that lay hidden in the earth. And they traded with their northern neighbors, the Egyptians, exchanging gold, copper, and other goods for grains, cloth, and finished products. This was the beginning of a relationship that would last for millennia, a relationship based on the glitter of a precious metal and the endurance of a people who could find it. Indeed, so important was the gold of Nubia that a whole region of northern Nubia, known as Wawat, became, in essence, Egypt's gold mine. The area of Wawat, roughly corresponding to Lower Nubia, between the first and second cataracts of the Nile, was the source of a huge portion of the gold that flowed into the treasuries of the pharaohs. And to secure this source, the Egyptians built fortresses, roads, and administrative centers. They sent armies and scribes and overseers, and they sent the miners, the prisoners, and the conscripts into the desert to do the impossible. And the miners developed their own culture around this impossible work. They lived in the mining camps, not just for weeks, but for months at a time. Some of them, we suspect, were effectively permanent. They knew the mines like the backs of their hands. They could sense when a vein was promising, when the rock was about to give way, when to trust the stone, and when to pull back. This is the kind of knowledge that can't be written down in a manual. It can only be passed from person to person through generations of shared experience. And so, the endurance we're talking about tonight is not just physical. It's also cultural. It's the endurance of a community, of a people who lived in a very harsh place and made it their own. Let's think for a moment about the very landscape of the mines. The eastern desert of Egypt, where many of these sites are located, is not a soft sea of sand dunes. It's a hard, jagged, rocky place, a desert of mountains and wadis, of sharp edges and steep inclines. It's a landscape that doesn't welcome you. It tests you. The rocks are dark, granites and schists, and they hold the heat like a storage heater, releasing it slowly through the night. The roads, if they can be called roads, are just paths, winding along the valleys, following the dry beds of ancient rivers that flowed, maybe, in some far wetter era. If you were to visit one of these ancient mining sites today, like the ones at Wadi Hammamet, or the more distant and mysterious ones in the desert east of Aswan, you would be struck by the silence. It's not a comfortable silence. It's a heavy silence, a silence that presses in on your ears. And in that silence, you would see the traces of the miners everywhere. The rounded holes of their quartz grinding mortars, worn deep into the living rock, the heaps of crushed gravel, the narrow openings of the shafts, gaping dark and closed up, still smelling faintly of dust. And you might shiver even in the heat, because the weight of all that past effort, all that suffering and endurance, is so present. One such site, which archaeologists have studied in great detail, is known as the ancient settlement of Marsa Alam, or more specifically, the mining areas around the modern town of Marsa Alam on the Red Sea coast. But perhaps a better example is the Mountain of Gold, if you like, known in ancient times as the Fawakir region, or the mine of the Wadi El Cid. This is a place that speaks to us directly across the ages. We know it was in use during the Ptolemaic period, and later, and perhaps even earlier. And there, in the ruins of the miners' huts, we find grinding stones and pottery, tools made of stone and bronze, and the remains of fires that burned thousands of years ago. Let me tell you about the grinding stations. They are simply large, flat rocks, slightly concave, worn smooth by years of use. A miner, or perhaps a woman, for we should remember that women were likely involved in the ore processing, would sit at one of these stations with a hand stone, a rounded cobble of a harder rock, and they would grind the quartz into a fine powder. Back and forth, a motion that was almost hypnotic. And they would do this for hours, days, weeks. The gold dust would mix with the rock dust, and the mixture would be collected, then washed, then ground again to release every last fleck. The process was laborious, but it was also, in its own way, meditative. The body falls into a rhythm, and the mind is left free to wander, to dream, to pray, to wonder. This is a key part of the endurance, this ability to let the mind drift, to detach oneself from the body's labor. The ancient miners, we can be sure, did not think constantly about the heat or the pain. They would have sunk into themselves, into a kind of trance, where time slowed down and the actions became automatic. It's the same state that a modern runner or a long-distance walker enters into. The body is doing its work, but the consciousness is somewhere else, floating. And in this floating state, pain becomes more manageable. The heat becomes just a sensation, not an enemy. And the hours pass, one after another, each one exactly like the last. But there were also moments of relief, of dark humor, of human connection. The mining camps were social places, filled with people from different backgrounds, prisoners and conscripts, Nubians and Egyptians, some speaking different languages. And in the shared struggle, bonds would have formed. The men would have told stories, perhaps, sitting around the fire at night. They would have gossiped, complained, joked. They would have sung, perhaps, in low voices, the old songs of their villages. These moments of connection, small as they were, would have been precious. They would have reminded the miners that they were still human, with the capacity for joy and for hope, even in the harshest of circumstances. And then there was the moment of discovery. For the miners, there was no triumph to match it. When a lump of quartz was broken open, and the gold flashed in the light, pure and bright, everything else faded away. The heat, the thirst, the exhaustion, all of it was forgotten, at least for a while, in the glory of that yellow gleam. And even the miners who were enslaved, who would never own the gold they extracted, could still feel a magnetic pull toward it, because it was beautiful, because it was the thing they were made to find, and because, in a strange way, it was the answer to their troubles, even if the answer belonged to someone else. We should also consider the possibility that some of the mining was done by free men, independent prospectors who came to the desert on their own, hoping to strike it rich. The ancients were not so different from us. They had dreams of wealth, of security, of a better life. And the gold of the Nubian desert called to these dreamers. They would have formed small partnerships, pooling their resources, hiring themselves out to dig and crush, and wash in exchange for a share of the profits. These men would have been tough, wiry, infinitely resourceful. They would have known all the tricks of the trade. They might even have owned the camels or donkeys that carried the water, making them essential to the larger enterprise. We've been talking about the miners, but what about the journey itself? For many, the journey to the gold mines was the hardest part, even harder than the mining. The roads leading into the eastern desert from the Nile Valley are long and barren. The ancient traveler would have left the green strip of farmland along the river and entered a world of rock and sand, where the only constants were the sun and the stones. The roads were marked by the remains of the early camps, with their broken pottery and their heaps of ashes. And the travelers would count each day's march, each well reached, each mountain passed, as a small victory. And what did they carry with them? Well, they carried the tools of their trade, for sure, but they also carried, in some small way, the hope of returning. They carried amulets, perhaps, little charms to protect them from harm. The ancient Egyptians and Nubians were deeply superstitious, and the desert was a place of demons and magic, where the traveler walked with fear and trembling. The miners would have made small offerings at the shrines that dotted the roads, seeking protection, seeking luck, seeking a safe return. These shrines were little more than piles of stones, but they were placed with care at passes and crossroads, where the road crossed a threshold into a new and more dangerous territory. The fear of the desert is something we can dimly understand from our own cozy rooms, but we can't fully grasp it. For the ancients, the desert was not a place of scenic landscapes or relaxing holidays. It was the literal edge of the world, the Red Land, as they called it, in contrast to the black land of the fertile Nile Valley. The desert was where order broke down and chaos reigned. It was where the great god Ra, the sun, traveled through the underworld at night, battling the serpent Apep. And to venture into this red land was to take one's life in one's hands, to confront the chaotic forces that threatened the cosmos itself. But the gold, oh, the gold of the red land, the flesh of the gods, the sun metal. That was worth the risk, apparently, for so many years. Let's drift back then to the mine, and to the shaft, and to the miner inside it. He is alone, or with one other, in the narrow, dark space. In front of him is the vein of quartz, glinting faintly with its secret treasure. Behind him is a chain of other workers, stretching to the surface, who will take the pieces of quartz he dislodges and keep them moving, hand over hand, until they reach the light. The miner's muscles ache. The stone is hard. The dust clings to his skin, mixing with his sweat, forming a thick paste that cakes his arms and face. He breathes in the dust, and his lungs feel raw. But he continues, because the sun outside is even more punishing, and because the work, for all its hardship, is its own kind of shelter. In the dim, cool, cramped darkness of the shaft, there is paradoxically a certain kind of refuge from the tyranny of the desert. The heat is still there, but it's the heat of his body, not the heat of the sun. And that, somehow, is easier to bear. And so, we might imagine him taking a brief rest. He leans back against the rock, closes his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, he is somewhere else. He is in his village, perhaps, by the river, feeling the cool mud between his toes. He is with his mother or his wife or his child, laughing at some silly thing. He is alive, with the sweetness of life on his tongue. Then the moment passes, and he opens his eyes, and he reaches for his hammer, and he begins again. Because that is what endurance is. It is not a dramatic struggle, a heroic battle against the elements. It is a series of small moments, one after another, strung together into a life. It is the choice, made over and over, to continue, to put one foot in front of the other, to lift the hammer one more time, to endure the heat for one more hour, one more day. There's a story, maybe apocryphal, maybe not, that the ancient miners believed that gold grew in the dark, like a plant, ripening in the veins of the quartz. They thought that the longer the quartz was left undisturbed, the more gold would accumulate. It's a slow, geological theory, a world away from our modern understanding of metal deposits. But in its own way, it's a lovely idea. It implies that the gold was alive, that it was a living part of the earth, and that the miner was not so much extracting it as harvesting it. And the miner in this story was not an invader, digging into the earth with violence, but a careful cultivator, waiting for the right moment to reap what the earth had sown. And perhaps, for the Nubian miners, who had lived so long in this harsh land, this idea made a kind of sense. They knew that the desert was not dead, that it had its own hidden life, and that the gold was one of its fruits. Of course, there is a darker side to all this. The gold didn't bring happiness to everyone. It brought wealth to the few and misery to the many. The pharaohs filled their tombs with it, believing that it would carry them into eternity. The miners, by contrast, were often buried in shallow graves, if they were buried at all. Their bodies were worn out, their teeth worn down from eating bread laced with the grit of stone, their lungs damaged by dust. They died young, often in terrible pain. And yet, it would be too easy to leave it there, to conclude that the whole enterprise was simply a tragedy. Because there were also the small things, the human things, the moments of laughter, the sharing of bread, the cool, clear taste of water at the end of a long day, the simple, physical relief of lying down on the warm earth and feeling your own tiredness slowly begin to ebb. Let's not romanticize it, either. The conditions were brutal, and we shouldn't look away from that brutality. But the story of the Nubian gold miners, is not only a story of suffering, it is also a story of human possibility, of what the human body and spirit can endure when they are pushed to their limits. It is a story about the strange and complex relationship between humans and the desire for treasure, between civilization and the wilderness, between the mind and the sun. And because it is coming to us through the long, slow filter of history, we can examine it with a certain amount of distance, a certain softness. We can tell it as a bedtime story, with all its edges smoothed, and see in these ancient people, in their fierce and lonely labor, a reflection of our own struggles, our own little attempts to endure the heat, whatever heat that might be. The stars are turning, slow and endless, over the sleeping desert. The fires in the camp have died down to glowing embers, and in the mines, the work has stopped for the night. The shafts are empty, or nearly so, and the only sound within them is the sound of a few last droplets of water, seeping from a crack in the rock, falling into the darkness, one by one. And high above, in the sky, the constellations wheel on their eternal paths. The miners, asleep on the ground, do not dream, perhaps, or dream of home. And we, drifting slowly in and out of our own sleepiness, can feel our eyelids growing heavy. But we're not done yet. We have more stories to tell, more secrets of the desert to uncover, more ways to understand this strange and distant world. But we'll get to them in time. There's no hurry. The night is long, and the sand is warm, and the gold is still there, deep in the earth, waiting for the dawn. So let us not think about the dawn just yet. There are still hours of darkness left, and in the quiet of those hours, we can consider another question, a question that might seem simple on its surface, but which has a great deal of hidden depth. How exactly did all these thousands of men, these hundreds upon hundreds of miners, mechanics, overseers, and guards, manage to survive in a place that seems so utterly incapable of supporting any life at all? We have talked about the heat and the dust and the endless work, but that work, as we know, cannot happen without at least two essential things: food and water. And in the middle of a vast, red, stone-filled emptiness, both of those things are terribly hard to come by. We touched on the wells earlier, the small pools of water that dotted the routes into the desert. But those wells were not nearly enough to sustain a full expedition of perhaps 1,000 people or more, traveling and working for months at a time. The water they carried with them, in heavy clay jars and animal skins, would only last so long. So the ancient Egyptians and Nubians had to devise a more elaborate system, a system of supply lines that stretched back to the Nile Valley like invisible threads. They would use donkeys, those patient, stubborn little beasts, to carry loads of food and water from the river to the mining camps. It was a slow, laborious process, and each trip would take many days. A donkey's cargo of water would be partly consumed along the way, and by the time the animal arrived at the mine, a good portion of its load would already be gone. So the water had to be refreshed, but it also had to be conserved, with every drop accounted for. Imagine the scene at a well. somewhere in the eastern desert, in the cool hour just before sunrise. The light is still dim and the stars are fading, but there is already a crowd of people gathered around the dark hole in the ground. They are water carriers, and their job is an ancient one, as old as not only the gold trade, but as human settlement itself. They lower a leather bucket on a rope down into the cool darkness until they hear the splash of it hitting the water below. Then they pull it up, hand over hand, feeling the weight of the precious liquid sloshing within. They pour it into a large clay jar, and they do this again and again until the jar is full, and then they load it onto the back of a donkey, securing it with cords so that it will not fall. The donkeys bray and stamp their feet, as if they too understand the seriousness of their task. And then the little caravan moves off, slowly, across the open ground, the sound of the bells around their necks jingling softly in the morning quiet. These water carriers would make the same journey day after day, week after week, month after month. They would become familiar with every stone and every bend in the path. They knew which spots offered a little shade, where the acacia trees grew, or where a large boulder cast a long and welcome shadow. They knew the moods of the sky, the way the heat shimmered and danced on the horizon, the way the wind would sometimes rise and send stinging sand into their faces. They were, in their own way, as much heroes as the miners themselves, for without them, the entire enterprise would collapse. Yet history rarely remembers them. They are the anonymous ones, the quiet ones, the ones who walk back and forth between the river and the desert, carrying life itself on their shoulders. But water, of course, is only half of the story. There is also the matter of bread and beer and onions, and the other simple foods that sustained these working men. And so, alongside the water carriers, there were also the bakers and the brewers, people who lived and worked in the mining camps, turning the grain that was carried from the Nile Valley into the daily rations that kept the miners alive. The grain would arrive in sacks, hauled by donkeys, and it would be stored in large, granary-like buildings, protected from the heat and the vermin. The bakers would then grind the grain into flour, using heavy stone querns, and they would knead the dough with their hands, stamping it flat and baking it in small, dome-shaped ovens made of clay. The loaves that came out of these ovens were simple and dense, but they were filling, and they were a welcome sight at the end of a long day. The brewing of beer was an equally important task. For the ancient Egyptians, beer was not a luxury. It was a staple of the diet, a source of nourishment and hydration. It was a thick, milky, slightly sour liquid, rather different from our modern lager, and it was made from barley and sometimes other grains. The process was somewhat complicated, involving the baking of a kind of bread, which was then crumbled and mixed with water and left to ferment in large jars. The resulting beverage was not very alcoholic, and it was often consumed while still young, within a few days of being made. But it was deeply refreshing, and it provided both calories and a sense of well-being. The miners would receive a daily ration of beer along with their bread, and they would drink it throughout the day, finding in it a little bit of comfort, a little taste of home. We might wonder then about the everyday scene in a mining camp in the late afternoon when the heat of the day has begun to soften and the long shadows start to stretch across the ground. The miners are emerging from the shafts, their bodies covered in a thick coat of dust and sweat. They are tired, aching, and hungry. They gather around the cooking fires, where the smell of bread and grilled onions fills the air. They sit on the warm sand in small groups, talking and laughing, or perhaps too exhausted to do much more than eat and drink in silence. They dip their bread into a pot of lentils or beans, or they eat a piece of dried fish brought from the Nile. They drink their beer, and they feel, for a brief while, the simple and profound pleasure of being alive, of being out of the sun, of being with other people who understand what they have been through. It is not a luxurious life, not by any means, but it is a human life, and it is full of its own small beauties. And what of the women and children? We often imagine that the mining expeditions were all male affairs, and perhaps they were, for the most part. But we should not be too quick to assume that there were no families present. The archaeology of these sites suggests that women were sometimes there, probably as cooks or brewers, or as wives who accompanied their husbands. And children, too, would have been present, helping with small tasks, learning the ways of the desert, and growing up with the dust and the heat as the backdrop to their childhood. It is a strange thought to imagine a child playing among the stones and broken rocks of a mining camp, far from the lush green fields of the Nile Valley. But children are adaptable, and they make games out of anything, and the desert, for all its harshness, must have offered its own kind of playground. They would throw stones at lizards, or chase the small desert birds, or simply sit in the shade of a rock and dream. The presence of children, though, brings us to another aspect of the miners' lives, an aspect that may seem dark, but which we can soften just a little in our telling. The miners, as we have said, were not always there by choice. Many of them were conscripted, taken from their homes, and forced to work in the desert for a period of time. Some were prisoners of war or criminals, punished for their misdeeds by being sent to the gold mines. We can imagine that these men were not happy, and that their lives were even more difficult than those who had come voluntarily. They would have had fewer freedoms, less food, and harsher treatment. They might have been chained together or guarded by soldiers to prevent them from fleeing. It is a sobering thought, and one that we should not shy away from, even in a sleepy bedtime story. But perhaps we can soften it by remembering that the ancient world was different from our own, and that the very concept of human rights, of justice, of the dignity of the individual was not what it is today. That does not make the injustice any less real, but it helps us to understand, in a broader sense, the terrible and complicated tapestry of human history. Still, we shouldn't dwell on the darkness for too long. The night is passing, and there are other stories to tell. So let us drift, as we so often do, to another topic, a more pleasant one. Let us talk about the religious life of the miners, the little rituals and observances that helped to make sense of the harsh world they inhabited. We mentioned earlier the shrines that dotted the roads, the piles of stones where travelers would stop and pray. But the miners also had their own gods, their own patron deities, whom they called upon for strength and protection. The god Min, for instance, was a god of the desert, of the eastern wastes, and of fertility and generation. He was often depicted with an erection, which might seem odd to us, but which was a symbol of his power to bring life out of barrenness. The miners would pray to Min, asking him to help them find gold and to keep them safe from the danger of the desert. Another god, Herakti, was a form of the sun god Ra, with a falcon's head. His name means Horus of the horizon, and he represented the sun as it rose in the east over the deserts where the gold was found. To the miners, he must have seemed a very present and powerful god, for they had to face the sun every day and to endure its unrelenting heat. They could not imagine the world without it, and so they incorporated it into their beliefs. There were also numerous minor spirits and demons, beings who lived in the rocks and the wadis, who could either help or hinder a traveler. The miners would have left offerings for these spirits, small pieces of food or a few drops of beer, to keep them on their side. It was a world filled with the supernatural, and the line between the physical and the spiritual was much thinner than it is for us. One particularly beautiful custom, perhaps, was the practice of leaving a small, votive object at a shrine as a sign of a prayer or a vow. A miner might carve a small image of his god or of himself or of his family and leave it at a temple or a rock shrine. These objects, often made of stone or clay, have been found by archaeologists, and they speak to us across the millennia of the hopes and fears of these ancient people. We can look at a small, rough carving of a man, and we can imagine what he might have been going through when he made it. Perhaps he was leaving on a dangerous expedition, and he wanted to ensure his safe return. Perhaps he was sick, and he prayed for healing. Perhaps he was just tired, and he wanted the strength to continue. These little objects are like windows into the hearts of people who lived long ago, and they remind us that despite all our differences, we are essentially the same. But let us move from the spiritual to the practical and consider for a moment the tools and techniques that the miners used to extract the precious metal from the stone. We have described the narrow shafts and the veins of quartz, but how exactly did they go about the actual work of breaking the rock and retrieving the gold? We tend to imagine mining as a noisy, mechanized process, with drills and dynamite and huge machines. But the ancient method was much simpler, much more intimate, and much more labor-intensive. The miners used stone hammers made from a hard rock like diorite or dolerite to pound against the quartz. They did not have pickaxes or chisels as we know them. They simply took a heavy, rounded stone, held it in both hands, and brought it down again and again on the same spot, slowly wearing away the rock and creating a groove. It was slow work, painstaking work, but it was effective, and it allowed them to follow the vein of gold-bearing quartz deep into the earth. They would also use fire setting, a technique that involved building a fire against the rock face and then throwing water on it to make it crack. The heat would expand the rock, and the sudden cooling would cause it to shatter and fracture, making it easier to break away. This was a dangerous and smoky process, and it must have filled the shafts with acrid fumes and intense heat. But it was one of the few ways they had to break through particularly hard rock. The miners would work in relays, with some men building the fires and others waiting to attack the weakened rock. It was a coordinated effort, and it required a great deal of skill and knowledge. The techniques were passed down from father to son, generation after generation, each wielder of the hammer adding his own incremental improvements. Once the quartz was extracted, it had to be crushed. This was often done at the surface, in the open air, where the sun was beating down, and the dust was even thicker. Large, heavy stones, known as grinding stones or mortars, were used to pulverize the quartz into a fine powder. The miner would place a lump of quartz into a hollow in the stone, and then use a smaller, handheld stone to pound it, again and again, until it was reduced to a gritty dust. The dust would then be mixed with water, and the resulting slurry would be carefully washed. The gold, being much denser than the other minerals, would settle to the bottom of a basin or a washing pan, while the lighter rock fragments would be carried away. This process, called wet panning, was simple, but it required a light hand and a careful eye. The gold would appear as tiny specks, glinting in the bottom of the pan, and the miner would collect them with a feather or a piece of reed. There is a fascinating theory that the legend of the Golden Fleece from Greek mythology might have originated from this practice. The ancient Greeks were aware of the gold mining techniques of the Egyptians and Nubians, and some scholars have suggested that the story of Jason and the Argonauts seeking the Golden Fleece might have been a distorted memory of a mining technique that used sheepskins to capture gold. The miners would spread a sheepskin in a sluice or a stream of water and let the gold-bearing slurry wash over it. The heavy gold particles would become trapped in the wool, while the lighter sediment was carried away. Then, at the end of the day, the sheepskin would be hung up to dry, and the gold dust would be brushed off, like a fleece made of gold. It is a charming idea, and it connects the distant world of the ancient Nubian mines with the Bronze Age myths of the Mediterranean. We do not know for sure if this is true, but it is a lovely story, and it adds another layer of enchantment to our tale. Let us now leave the dusty camps and the grinding stones and take a step back, a big step back, to look at the larger picture. The gold that was mined in this hostile place did not stay in the desert. It was transported back to the Nile Valley, and from there, it was sent to the great cities and temples of Egypt. It was used to make jewelry, to cover statues, and to adorn the tombs of the pharaohs. The gold was a symbol of the sun, of Ra, of eternal light, and it was central to the royal ideology of ancient Egypt. The pharaoh, the living Horus, was said to have skin of gold, and his palace was filled with golden furniture and golden treasures. The gold from the Nubian mines, then, was not just a commodity. It was a sacred substance, infused with divine meaning, connecting the ruler to the gods and ensuring the eternity of his reign. This means that the miners, in their humble, back-breaking labor, were not just extracting a metal. They were providing the raw material for an entire civilization, for the temples and the tombs and the great works of art that we still admire today. When we look at the golden mask of Tutankhamun, we are looking at a product of that labor, a sum of thousands of human hours spent in the scorching desert, hammering at quartz, washing the dust, and enduring the pain. It is a sobering thought, and it connects us directly to those ancient people. We might feel a mixture of awe and sadness, a recognition of their suffering and their achievement, all bound up together. And perhaps, in some small way, we can honor them by remembering them, by telling their story, and by acknowledging that the beautiful objects we marvel at in museums come not just from the taste of kings, but from the toil of ordinary men. But we must not make this more melancholic than it needs to be. The miners themselves, we should remember, lived their lives in the moment. They did not think about the distant future, or about the museums and archaeologists and bedtime storytellers who would come after them. They thought about the next hour, the next day, the next bite of bread, the next swallow of beer. They were, in many ways, just like us, caught up in the small details of their own existence, trying to find a little happiness in the midst of their struggles. The sun was hot for them, just as it is hot for us on a summer's day. But for them, it was so much more. It was an enemy, an oppressor, a force that could kill in a matter of hours. Yet they did not stop fighting. They did not give up. They endured. And perhaps that is the real story of the Nubian gold miners, beneath all the details of hammers and wells, and bread and beer. It is a story about the human will to survive, about the quiet perseverance that allows us to face impossible odds and keep going. It is a story about the things we are willing to suffer for, the gold that we all seek, whether it is a metal deep in the ground or a dream in our hearts. It is a story that is, in the end, not so much about the past, but about the present, about ourselves, about the ways we, too, are miners in our own lives, digging deep, enduring the heat, and hoping for a little glint of treasure at the end of the day. The stars have shifted now, further along their eternal path, and the night is beginning to feel its age. The camp, which was so lively an hour ago, has quieted down even further. The fires have died down to faint orange glows, and the sound of the men's breathing, the deep, rhythmic breathing of sleep, fills the air. In the distance, a jackal cries, a sound that is at once wild and lonely. But even that does not disturb the sleepers. They are too tired, too lost in their dreams of home and of the river. And we, too, in our own rooms, perhaps with a blanket pulled up to our chins, can feel a similar peace, a similar distance from the cares of the day. We could go on, of course. There are so many more stories to tell. We could talk about the geology of the gold deposits, the ancient remains of mines and settlements that have been excavated, and the discoveries that have been made by archaeologists. We could talk about the great fortress of Buhin, further south in Nubia, which guarded the trade routes and protected the miners from raiders. We could talk about the inscriptions left by the expeditions, the graffiti that records the names of the men and their cities, and the numbers of days they spent in the desert. We could talk about the fascinating accounts of Greek and Roman writers, like Agatharchides, who described the conditions in the gold mines with a degree of horror and compassion. But perhaps it is better to stop here, on this quiet night, with the sleepers and the stars, and to leave the rest for another time. There is no rush, no urgency. The desert has been there for millions of years, and it will continue to be there for millions more. The gold will wait, and we can return, if we wish, to this world, to these people, to these stories, whenever we feel the need for a little quiet, a little distance, a little sleep. And so, as we draw this part of our tale to close, let us imagine the camp one last time. The moon has set, and the sky is dark, scattered with a million points of light. The wind has dropped, and a profound stillness lies over the land. The miners are asleep, their bodies resting on mats of woven reeds, their heads pillowed on rocks or bundles of cloth. They are dreaming, perhaps, of the cool water of the Nile, of the green fields, and the shade of the sycamore trees. They are far from home, but in their dreams they are there. And in the morning, when the sun rises again, they will wake and they will stretch, and they will pick up their hammers, and they will go down into the earth once more. But for now, there is nothing but the deep, untroubled quiet of the night. And we, too, can let our eyes close and feel the warmth of our own beds, and let the story drift away into the stillness, like a wisp of smoke from a dying fire. Sleep, then, if you can. Let go of the day. Let the history and the gold and the desert fade into the background, and know that you are safe and warm and far from any hardship. The Nubian miners long ago might have wished for such comfort, and perhaps we owe them a small tribute by appreciating the ease of our own lives. They worked and suffered so that we might study and learn, and in a very real sense, they gave us a part of their lives. So let us honor them, not with tears, but with a gentle acknowledgement, a quiet nod in the direction of the past. And then let us turn, with a soft sigh, to the darkness, and the quiet, and the slow descent into dreams. There will be more to tell on some other night, when the world is hushed and the mood is right. But now, it is time to rest. It is time to close your eyes. It is time to let the silence embrace you, and the warmth of the blanket, and the long, slow rhythm of your own breathing. Good night, then, to the miners, and to you. Good night to the gold, and the desert, and the stars. Good night, until we meet again, in the soft and sleepy hush of another story. And yet, as you close your eyes, you may find that sleep does not come at once. It rarely does when the mind is full of images. The desert, the mines, the weary faces of the ancient workers, they all drift across the inner eye like dust motes in a beam of moonlight. And so, perhaps, we might stay here just a little longer, not quite awake, not quite asleep, and let the story wind on, as stories do when they are left to their own devices. There is no hurry, none at all. The night is long, and the past is longer still. Let us think, if you are willing, about the rock itself, the stone in which the gold was born. For the gold that the Nubian miners extracted with such effort did not arrive in the desert by accident. It was formed deep within the earth, in the fiery heart of ancient mountain ranges, under immense pressure and heat over millions upon millions of years. The great granite peaks that rise out of the eastern desert were once molten rock, cooling slowly in the depths of time. As they cooled, they cracked and fissured, and through these cracks, superheated fluids rich in minerals pushed their way upwards. When these fluids cooled, they left behind veins of quartz, hard and white, and within the quartz, flecks and threads of gold. The miners, of course, did not know any of this. They did not know about millions of years or the slow dance of plate tectonics. But they knew that the white rock, the quartz, was the mother of gold, and they followed it with an instinct honed by centuries of experience. When they found a vein, they would trace it into the hillside, digging narrow shafts that followed the twisting course of the quartz deep into the mountain. The shafts are still there today, thousands of years later, stretching for hundreds of meters into the darkness, barely wide enough for a man to turn around. In some of these ancient tunnels, archaeologists have found the remains of fires, evidence that the miners used a technique of heating the rock and then quenching it with cold water to make it crack. It was a slow, dangerous process, and the air inside these shafts, even with the deepest workings, was hot and heavy and thick with dust. Imagine, if you can, being down there. The light of a single oil lamp flickering on the rock walls, the sound of your own breathing echoing in the narrow space, the weight of the mountain pressing down above you. The heat is not the bright, dry heat of the surface with its occasional breeze. It is an underground heat, stifling, relentless, a heat that clings to the skin and fills the lungs. The miners who worked these shafts were often naked, or nearly so, their bodies slick with sweat, their muscles aching from the constant hammering, their muscles aching from the constant hammering, their eyes stinging from the smoke of the oil lamps, their ears filled with the ceaseless ring of stone upon stone. And yet, they did not stop. They could not stop, not for long, because the work was measured, and the days were numbered, and the gold had to be brought out before the water ran out, and the heat became truly unbearable. But we must not imagine that they endured this without any relief, without any wisdom of their own. For the desert, though harsh, is also a place of subtle rhythms, and the miners, after generations of living at its edges, understood those rhythms the way a sailor understands the sea. They knew, for instance, that there were cooler hours in the day, and they used them wisely. The work in the deep shafts was often done in the late afternoon and the evening, when the sun had lost its fiercest edge, and the air above ground began to stir with the first slow breaths of dusk. The surface workers, the ones who broke the quartz and carried the stones, would begin their labors in the gray hour before sunrise, when the stars were still fading and the coolness of the night had not yet been burned away. There is a particular quality to the desert just before dawn. It is a time of absolute stillness, when the animals that hunt at night have gone to their rest, and the animals that hunt by day have not yet stirred. The sky turns from black to a deep, soft blue, and then to a shade of apricot that seems to glow from within. The air is cool, almost cold, and carries the scent of dry earth, and if you are near the river, the faint, sweet smell of water and reeds. The miners would wake in this half-light, their bodies stiff from the night, and they would eat a small meal, perhaps some bread and a few dates soaked in water, and they would drink, and then they would set out for the mines. The walk from the camp to the workings was not long, but it was enough to fully wake the body. The men walked in loose groups, their tools over their shoulders, their clay water jars tied at their waists. They did not talk much at this hour, for talk requires energy, and energy was to be saved for the work. But there was a quiet companionship among them, the easy familiarity of men who have shared hardship for many weeks. A nod, a hand on a shoulder, a small joke murmured in the old language, and they would spread out across the hillside, each to his own post. The first task of the day was the fire setting for those working on the new veins. This was a technique that required patience and care. The miners would build a fire against the face of the rock, using wood that had been carried from the river valley, a precious commodity that was rationed like water. The fire would be allowed to burn fiercely, heating the stone until it was almost glowing. And then, at the signal, the miners would pour cold water over the hot surface. The sudden change in temperature would cause the rock to crack and flake, making it easier to break with their hammers and wedges. It was a spectacular sight, especially on a cool morning, when the steam would rise in great white clouds, and the hiss of the water on the stone would echo off the hillsides. But it was also exhausting work, for the fire consumed the oxygen in the air, and the heat radiating from the rock was intense. The men who managed the fire worked in shifts, dashing in to pour the water, and then retreating to gasp the fresher air. They had learned, over the years, to control their breathing, to not panic when the heat pressed in on them, to trust that the cooler air was just a few steps away. And when the rock cracked, there was a moment of quiet satisfaction, a small victory in the long, slow war against the mountain. Further down the slope, the men who worked the existing shafts would be busy as well. The shafts, as we have said, were not like the tidy, well-ventilated tunnels of later mines. They were cramped, twisting passages, sometimes no more than a meter high, and they followed the veins of quartz with an almost obsessive precision. The miners would lie on their sides or crouch on their haunches, swinging their stone hammers in short, controlled arcs. The dust was terrible, and the heat was worse. To combat the dust, some of the men would moisten cloths and tie them over their mouths and noses, an early form of the mask that we still use today. And to combat the heat, they would pour small quantities of water over their heads and chests, letting the evaporation cool their skin. But water was scarce, and every jar of it was a precious thing. not to be wasted. So they rationed it carefully, a sip at a time, a few drops for the cloth, a little to revive a man who was beginning to flag. It is hard, perhaps, to fully understand what it meant to be thirsty in that environment. In our comfortable lives, we have water at every turn, from taps and bottles and fountains. We can drink whenever we wish, and we rarely think about it. But in the desert, thirst is a constant companion, a whisper at the back of the mind, a dryness in the throat that never quite goes away. The miners carried their water in clay jars, which kept it cool through the miracle of evaporation. The jars were placed in the shade of the mine entrance, and the men would take their turns to drink, a single mouthful, rolling it around their mouths before swallowing. They learned to drink slowly, to make it last, to extend the moment of relief as long as possible. And what of the food? We have mentioned bread and dates, but there was more to the diet, of course. The expeditions were supplied from the river valley, with grain brought in by donkey caravan. The grain would be ground into flour, and the flour mixed with water and baked into flat, round loaves on heated stones. These loaves were dense and heavy, not like the airy breads of today, but they were filling, and they traveled well. With the bread, the miners would eat beans, cooked slowly in clay pots, and onions and garlic. And occasionally, if the expedition was well funded, some dried fish or a little meat. There were also the fruits of the desert itself, the small, sweet berries of the dom palm, and the bitter but nourishing fruit of the acacia tree. These were gathered by the women and children who sometimes accompanied the expeditions, and they added a little variety to a diet that must have become monotonous after many weeks. The women and children, we should not forget them. They were not just passive passengers on these journeys into the desert. They played an essential role in the life of the camp. The women were responsible for the preparation of the food, the maintenance of the water jars, the mending of the clothes and the sandals, and the offering of small comforts to the men when they returned from the mines. They also worked themselves, breaking the ore into smaller pieces, sorting the gold-bearing quartz from the waste rock, and washing the crushed material in shallow basins of water. This was skilled work, requiring a keen eye and a steady hand, and it was often the women who were the most adept at it. The children, meanwhile, were given lighter tasks, carrying water to the workmen, fetching firewood, and watching over the camp's few animals. Their laughter, the quiet chatter of their games, must have been a comfort in the harshness of the environment, a reminder that life was not only about stone and sweat and gold. But we must be careful not to romanticize this too much. The conditions were brutal, and the mortality rate was high. Men died from heat stroke, from exhaustion, from accidents in the mines, from diseases that spread quickly in the crowded camps. It is a sobering thought, and one that we might be tempted to push away in the comfort of our own beds. And yet, the truth of it is part of the story, and it is a truth that we can hold gently without dwelling on it too heavily. We can acknowledge the harshness, and at the same time, we can marvel at the endurance of the human spirit, the willingness to face such dangers for the sake of something so small and so beautiful as gold. The gold, in the end, was not really for the miners themselves, of course. They were workers for the state, organized by officials who represented the pharaoh. The gold they extracted was carried back to Egypt to be stored in the treasuries of the temples, to be fashioned into jewelry and ornaments for the royal court, to be used in trade with distant kingdoms. The miners themselves received, in exchange for their labor, their food and water and shelter, and the hope of some small reward at the end of their service. It is a strange transaction when one thinks about it. Centuries of hardship condensed into the gleam of a golden bracelet on the arm of a pharaoh who never saw the men who mined it. But such was the world, and such was the order of things. Maybe we should pause here in our minds and consider what it might have been like to be one of those miners, one of the thousands whose names we do not know. What did they feel, lying in their tents at night, their bodies aching, their hearts full of a longing that they could not always express? Perhaps they thought of their villages, of the green fields along the Nile, of the women who sang as they drew water from the river, of their children playing in the shallows. Perhaps they thought of the festivals, the great gatherings of the community, the smell of roasted meat, and the sound of drums, and the laughter that echoed into the night. And then they would look up at the desert sky, so different from the sky of home, and they would feel the great distance between themselves and all they loved. But they would not give up. That is the remarkable thing. They would wake again in the morning, and they would do it all over again, day after day, week after week, until their service was complete and they could return home. And when they returned, they would be welcomed, perhaps as heroes, perhaps simply as weary men and women who had done their duty. They would show the small gifts they had brought, the polished stones, the carved amulets, the little things they had made in the quiet hours to pass the time. And life would go on as it always does until the next call came, the next expedition, the next journey into the desert. There were some, we should note, who did not return. The inscriptions left by the expeditions sometimes record the deaths of workers, with a brief note of their names and their homes. These were not elaborate memorials, but they were enough. They were, in a sense, a gesture of remembrance, a way of saying that the dead had not been forgotten, that their names would still be spoken, at least for a while. In the shifting sands of the desert, even a name is a fragile thing. And yet these names have survived, carved into rock, protected from the wind and the sun, waiting for us to find them thousands of years later. We can imagine, if we like, the night after such a death was recorded. The camp would be quieter than usual, the mood somber. The men would sit a little closer to the fires, and their talk would be softer, more reflective. They would speak of the one who had been lost, remembering his jokes, his skills, the way he had always been the first to volunteer for the most dangerous tasks. And then, as the night deepened, they would fall silent, each lost in his own thoughts, each aware that the desert could claim any of them at any moment. And in the morning, they would go back to work, because there was nothing else to do, and because the living must honor the dead by continuing to live. The heat, we have said, was relentless, but it was not uniform. There were variations, small mercies that the miners learned to appreciate. The coolness of the early morning, the brief but blessed shade of a rock overhang during the hottest part of the day, the arrival of a rare cloud that would block the sun for a few precious minutes. The miners would savor these moments, lying back against the warm stone, closing their eyes, feeling the sweat begin to dry on their skin. They would drink the last few drops from their water jars, and they would not think about the afternoon ahead, because thinking about it would only make it harder. And then there were the winds, the blessed winds that would sometimes rise in the late afternoon. The desert is not always still. It has its own weather, its own moods. The wind would come from the north, cool and dry, and it would sweep across the camp, blowing away the dust, refreshing the air. The miners would stand and face it, letting it play over their bodies, letting it carry away the heat of the day. For a moment, they would feel almost clean, almost cool, and the memory of that feeling would sustain them through the night. As the seasons turned, the expeditions would be timed to avoid the very worst of the summer heat. The ancients knew, just as we know, that the summer sun in the eastern desert is a thing to be feared. So the expeditions would often set out in the autumn, after the worst of the heat had subsided, and they would return in the spring, before the next summer took hold. The winters in the desert are mild, with cool nights and pleasantly warm days, and this was the ideal season for the work. But even in the winter, the heat inside the mines could be oppressive, for the rock retained the warmth of the sun, and the confined spaces allowed no breeze to penetrate. There is a particular memory, perhaps, that we can conjure. A miner emerging from a shaft after a long shift, his body covered in a fine layer of golden dust, his eyes squinting against the light. He would blink and look up at the sky and take a deep breath of the open air. The sun would be low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor, and the light would have that soft, golden quality that seems to glow from within. He would walk slowly to the water jar, and he would drink, and the water would be warm, but it would be wonderful. And then he would sit down, his back against the rock, and he would watch the sun set, and he would feel, despite everything, a kind of peace. This is, perhaps, the heart of the story. Not the gold, not the heat, not the hardship, but the moments of quiet that came in between. The shared meal at the end of the day, when the workers would gather around the fire and eat their bread and beans, and the conversation would flow, and the little jokes would be told, the songs that someone would sing, perhaps a song from home, a song about the Nile and the fields and the pretty girls with flowers in their hair, the children chasing each other through the edges of the camp, their laughter ringing out into the darkness, the women sitting together, talking softly, sharing the small news of the day. These were the things that made the hardship bearable, the threads of humanity that wove through the tapestry of the desert. And we, too, in our own lives, have these threads. We have our quiet moments, our shared meals, our songs, and our laughter. The circumstances are different, the dangers are fewer, but the need for connection is the same. In listening to this story, in imagining ourselves among those miners, we are, in a small way, joining that long line of humanity, reaching across the centuries to share in a common experience. It is a strange and wonderful thing, this bond that connects us to the past, and it is one of the reasons why we tell stories in the first place. Perhaps you have begun to feel drowsy now, as the night has worn on and the story has unfolded at its own unhurried pace. That is good. That is as it should be. This is a story to listen to as you drift toward the edge of sleep, a story to soften the edges of the day, a story to leave you with a sense of calm and connectedness. Do not try to hold onto every detail. Let the images come and go like the gentle waves of the night, and let your mind follow the narrative wherever it leads. But we are not quite done yet, for there is one more scene that calls to us, one more corner of this ancient world that we might visit before we close the book. It is a scene from the depths of the mine, a scene that has been recreated in our imagination from the scraps of evidence left by the archaeologists. In one of the deepest shafts, far from the entrance, there is a small chamber where the miners have been working for many days. The air is thick, almost solid with dust and heat, and the only light comes from a single clay lamp, its flame a tiny, flickering point in the darkness. The miners work in silence, their movements slow and deliberate, their bodies glistening with sweat. They have been here since the early morning, and their strength is beginning to flag. One of the men, an older miner with gray in his beard, pauses and straightens his back. He cannot stand fully upright, for the ceiling is too low, but he can ease the strain in his muscles. He closes his eyes for a moment, and he listens to the sounds of his own body, the thud of his heart, the hiss of his breath. He feels the weight of the mountain above him, the immense, silent pressure of all that stone. And yet, he does not feel afraid. He has been a miner all his life, as his father was before him, and his grandfather before that. The darkness of the mine is as familiar to him as the light of day. He opens his eyes, and he looks at the walls of the shaft. There, caught in the lamplight, is a glint of gold, a tiny thread of the precious metal that has justified all this effort, all this danger. He reaches out and touches it, feeling the cool, hard reality of it beneath his fingertips. And in that moment, he feels a connection to something larger than himself, to the long chain of miners who have come before him, to the universe that has hidden this treasure in the heart of the rock. He smiles, a small, private smile, and he picks up his hammer once more, and he goes back to work. The sound of his hammering echoes through the shaft, a rhythmic, almost musical sound that is taken up by the other miners. They work together in a kind of harmony, the blows of their hammers falling one after another like a slow, steady heartbeat. Dust rises and hangs in the air, catching the lamplight, and the heat continues to press in on them. But they do not stop. They cannot stop, not until the shift is done and the gold is won. And when the shift is done, when the last of the quartz has been extracted and the men have climbed wearily back to the surface, the evening air will be cool on their skin, and the sky will be full of stars, and they will walk back to the camp, and the women will be waiting with food and water and the soft murmur of welcome. They will sit down to eat, and someone will begin to tell a story, perhaps the very story you are listening to now, a story of the old days, a story of gold and heat and endurance. And the children will listen, their eyes wide, and the adults will nod, recognizing the truth of it, and the story will weave its way into the memory of the camp. We have traveled far tonight, you and I. We have walked through the desert, descended into the mines, sat by the fires, and shared in the lives of people who lived thousands of years before us. And now, as the night reaches its deepest, quietest hour, it is time to let go, to release the threads of the story and drift into sleep. The desert will wait, the gold will wait, and the stories will be here waiting for us whenever we choose to return. So let us close our eyes now and let the images fade one by one, like lamps being extinguished across a vast and ancient city. Let the sound of the hammering fade into the distance, replaced by the soft, regular rhythm of our own hearts. Let the heat of the desert dissolve until all that remains is the warmth of the blanket around us and the gentle, soothing darkness of our own rooms. We will dream, perhaps, of nothing at all. Or perhaps we will dream of the desert, of vast horizons and endless skies, of the smell of dry earth and the taste of cool water, of the faces of the miners and the glint of gold in the lamplight. These dreams will be gentle, for they are the residue of a story told with care, and they will pass, as all dreams do, leaving only a sense of peace. And when we wake in the morning, the desert will be far away, and the world of the present will claim us once more. But the memory of this story, the feeling of having journeyed to a distant time and place, will linger like the faint scent of wood smoke on a coat. And if, one day, you hear a sound that reminds you of the desert, or feel a warmth that recalls the sun on ancient stone, you will remember the Nubian miners, and you will smile, and you will be grateful for the small comforts of your own life. That is all a story can do when it is told well. It can transport us, and it can return us, and it can leave us just a little more aware of the world and of ourselves. And now, as the last words of this tale fade into the stillness, we can let ourselves go, trusting that the night will hold us, and that sleep will come gentle and complete. Good night, then, to the miners and to you. Good night to the gold and the desert and the stars. Good night to the heat and the dust and the stone. And above all, good night to the quiet, the deep and restful quiet that now envelops us like a soft and endless blanket. Sleep well and let the dreams come, and know that you are safe and warm and at peace. For the story is over, the journey is done, and there is nothing left to do but rest and breathe and let the night carry you away.